Thank you. Well, good evening to such an enormous crowd. This is not our normal attendance. Apologies for absence. I'm aware of Councillor Davis.
You've got the list, sorry.
Sorry, yeah. Councillor Davis, Councillor Fuller, Councillor Clark, Councillor Hudson.
Yes, Councillor Clark is representing the council at a fairly important planning decision tonight, since we're here. Well, my pleasure is to introduce representatives in connection with the proposed Lewis Field development. Because we've got quite a full agenda, we're kind of having to be relatively time limited. I'm aware that Peter Miller is going to do a swift introduction. There might be up to 3 other people speaking in connection with the application, and then we've got a single resident speaking, as it were, about their own concerns. And I suspect most of us have already seen the material that he has provided to us. So, without further ado, can I ask Peter Miller to start, please?
Shall I sit here, stand here in the front?
You'll probably find it easy to come around the front.
Yes, so I'm Peter Miller. My sister, I'm representing my sister as well. Our mother and father we bought the house, we bought Orchard House, where Jonathan now lives, in, I think it was 1962, and my parents bought the field in 1965. It was always clear that it would fall to Anne and myself to, that something would be built on it eventually, and it would be us who would be responsible for that. We have taken a long time to choose a development partner, and we put quite stiff environmental and social requirements on that development in exchange for a reduced fee. To be clear, we had 5 letters asking to buy the field from us, just simple, outright, in the last 2 weeks, which we don't reply to. So I'm honoured to have Town and Mull, who they can't fit all the awards that they've won on the bottom of their letterhead. They have to just restrict themselves to 1 year's worth of awards. And I'll leave them to take it up from there. But it's just lovely to have Alan Raden interested in living there, who taught me chemistry, and other people here. So, okay.
Perhaps as you speak, you could introduce yourselves.
Yeah, we will do. Yeah, that's good. Should we just
We're ready to go.
Perfect. Okay. Super. Okay, great. Yeah, good evening. My name is Johnny Anstead, one of the 2 founding directors of Town, joined by Meredith and Susie here from Mole Architects, who'll be able to give you a bit more information about Mole later. Town is a small developer, an SME. We focus on housing development, and we have a mission which is to build good places for better lives. We're a profit with purpose developer, so we're private sector, but we're really interested in projects where we can actually help to create places which are better than they otherwise might be, and where people can live in a way that's more sustainably more environmentally responsible and more sustainable. So we're all really, we're very focused on building homes of good environmental quality, good environmental performance, places where people can live in a more communal and responsible way, in a more mutually supportive way. And we try and build places where we can make improvements to the wider place and take people's concerns about wider impacts into account, and hopefully create positive impacts from development rather than just negative impacts. Over to Meredith to introduce Mole.
Hi, I'm Meredith Bowles. I'm a director of Mole. And as a practice, we've been in East Anglia. My office is now in Cambridge, but been in East Anglia for over 20 years. And mostly we're doing houses and housing. And early on in the practice, we worked with a lot of people who were interested in making low energy houses. I live in the Fens, that's my house on the right-hand side, just the other side of Ely. But over the last 10 years, we've been concentrated on housing rather than houses, working for both private developers, local authority, affordable housing, and community groups. a few of our projects that we have on at the moment or have finished recently. On the left-hand side is a project for Girton Town Charity. That's alms houses built to a passive house standard. In the centre, there's a project we did about in 2009, which was one of the earliest passive house affordable housing developments for Broadland Housing in Norfolk. And on the right-hand side is a project we finished a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, Marmalade Lane, which was for a community group, a co-housing group for 42 homes in Cambridge, which has ended up being hugely successful and has been used as an example of how you can use design to assist creating a good place to live for people more communally. And John is going to talk a bit more about that project.
So I should start by saying that this is an example of what we do, and this is a project that we have built with Meredith and his colleagues at Mole. I don't think that anybody is saying for one moment that this is the right answer for Oundle. We really do recognise that Oundle is a very different place from Cambridge, and so we wouldn't want anyone to think that because we've built this in Cambridge that this is what's going to be built in its, in its architecture or its design in Oundle. We really do believe that it's important to get to know a place and to build and to respond to that in the way that we design. And there'll be lots of questions that we haven't really started to approach yet, like what will these buildings look like? What will they be made out of? What is the vernacular that's appropriate to Oundle? How does one sort of go about creating a modern version of Oundle, which has got such amazing building traditions? So none of this is intended to provide answers to those questions. It's really just to show you that we do mean quality, and that we do mean it when we say that we're going to deliver something that we believe in and that we hope you'll believe in too. So there were just a few things about Marmalade Lane that we wanted to focus on. It's a scheme that we worked with Meredith on over several years between 2015 and 2019. And we also worked, as Meredith said, with the future residents of that scheme. So through that planning period and through the delivery of that scheme, we were working closely with the people who ended up living there. And it gave us a lot of insight into what it's like to build for people's real needs, rather than just what estate agents or developers perceive to be people's real needs, because we were actually able to talk to the future residents of that place and say, how would you like it to be? How do you want the garden to be? How do you want your floor plans and so on to be? And Frances, who's our colleague here this evening, we actually know her because she was one of the residents of Marmalade Lane who we worked with over that time period. So there are 4 themes, just to point them out really, and things that do to some degree have some resonance with what we'd be looking at here in Oundle. The first is that we built a place that was focused around the needs of people, and at the heart of it, it had a really strong people-focused public realm where children can play and people can use in all sorts of ways for socialising and other, food growing and other things. We built a very low energy scheme, so we built it out of timber using modern methods of construction. We used triple glazed windows. And we use renewable energy through the form of air source heat pumps to provide all of the heating to all of the homes on the scheme. Food growing and nature were really intrinsic to the scheme, and at the heart of the development is a very large shared garden with an ancient hedgerow that runs through it, and which is now a real source of biodiversity and greenery that supports people's well-being and quality of life in that development. And then the final point was that we offered design choice through to the residents. So we worked to create a series of options that enabled the residents of Marmalade Lane to choose from different materials, different colours of brick, different internal floor layouts, different kitchen finishes, much beyond what a typical volume house builder would offer in terms of the kind of the power of choice that people have over their future homes. We're always mindful that buying a home is the most expensive investment that any of us make, and it kind of seems crazy to us how little choice people have in that, in the usual way of things, and we wanted to make that better. So we've started to think about how one would start to apply those kind of lines of thinking to Oundle, recognising that this is a very, very different location, and we're going to have to a very great degree, we're going to have to go back to basics and do our research again. So this is very much something, I should say, we're at the beginning of the process here. We wanted to come and talk to you as a council early on. We're really not well advanced through our process yet, but we would like to talk to you about some of the principles that are going to inform it and show you our work to date. we've boiled it down to 5 starter principles. The first one is that we should be building a place that is respectful to its context. That's both its very local context and also the town that it's part of. We want to build a place that has sociable public realms at its heart, sociable streets where people can be out and enjoy the place that they live in, not just their home and garden. Community focus. Peter and Anne were really clear that they didn't want this to be, isolated, large executive homes, but they wanted to have a mix of people of different ages and different needs, intermingling and creating a real community. Fourth is sustainable homes. I've mentioned that in the context of Marmalade Lane, but we really want to push it further here. And Peter and Anne have made it very clear that they would like to see very high environmental standards in this scheme, and that's part of the legal contract that we have with them. And then finally, enhanced biodiversity. It's a green field at the moment, and we really need to look very carefully about how we can make that perform well for nature and not just for people. And that's one of our lines of inquiry. And the final point for me is just to say that we're trying to do something a little bit innovative here, which is that a little bit like Marmalade Lane, we are looking to work with the people who might live here in the future to go through a process of co-design, which means working together to design this place. We're calling it the building group approach, which is something that's quite common in some European countries, such as Germany, where it's called Baugruppe. And it's really a piece of land with a developer or an owner and a bunch of people who might live there who work together through a design process in the kind of way that I've described. And I'm happy that some of the possible members of our building group are here this evening, and that's a group that's starting to form, and we'll be working with them over the coming months. The really great thing about this is that it does 2 things really. One, it helps us to design somewhere which is actually going to be meeting the needs of the people who live there, which lots of places wouldn't, because we can work directly with them. And the second is that through that process, the people who will end up living there get an opportunity to know each other, so that when they eventually move in, they will know their neighbours and can sort of look out for each other. And we all know the benefits of knowing our neighbours and the problems of social isolation that exist in lots of places in the modern age. And so this process, we think, is going to be very interesting, will hopefully lead to much higher quality development than you might otherwise get, and will yield something that's a really vital community at the end of the process. I'm going to pass back to Mole now to talk us through some of the early thinking.
Thanks, John. So you all know the site on Benefit Road much better than us, I'm sure. But for us as architects, it's interesting to think what would be an appropriate development, what would be an appropriate architecture for that particular place. And as a site, it's somewhere between the historic core of Oundle and the suburban developments further on out of Benefit Road. And they're 2 very different environments, as you know. One typically with standalone houses with lots of space around them, and the other one, which we all know well, is a compact medieval streets. So how to make an architecture that is appropriate for both those sides. Oundle is extraordinary. It would be mad to think, as an architect, it's a gift to think about designing in a context that has such a strong presence. And for us to understand what those characters might be and how we might respond to them was our first task. Of course, it's difficult to reduce it down, but in an attempt to somehow characterize it, the most obvious one is the consistency of the material quality of the place, which is both the color as well as the material. The second is that the centre of historic Oundle is by and large connected together in either terraces or houses that are abutting one another. So they're continuous streets of frontages. The third one is the historic pattern of development has the little lanes running perpendicular to the main roads, which is following the lines of the original Burgage plots. And the fourth, perhaps, is the way in which subsequent outbuildings or secondary structures give an informality to the original buildings. So there's a slightly haphazard quality as soon as you go behind the kind of formal facade. So there are aspects of Oundle which we've identified, which we'd like to bring forward into how to think about contemporary development. The site, as you know, slopes down, and it has both opportunities and constraints. The obvious constraint being at the bottom of the hill, with the possible flooding, or you know it has flooded, and how that constrains what we're able to do and how we need to design for that. The second is the desire to retain both the allotments and some space around the site, so not to fully develop the site. And the opportunity, of course, is it's a sloping site which faces south, so it's a fantastic opportunity to make passive solar houses, which will perform much better in environmental terms. So on to our proposals that Susie will take you through.
So this is our initial proposal, and this is a site plan. You can see on the right-hand side of the plan are the existing allotments which will be retained on site. We have the brook to the bottom of the site, and this strip of land will remain public use space with pathway for current walkers to walk along there and move back into town. And so it was really key to keep this open green space for the people of Oundle. The development then sits to the northwest of this. You can see that largely the format is in terrace homes in the blue and purple shown here, harking back to the Oundle street patterns and kind of connecting into that grain. And then along the west side, we have semi-detached homes, which speak more to what is happening in Clifton Drive, directly adjacent to the site. And to the east and west of this, we have the proposed parking, which is in line with the current standards for parking. So there's a shared area for everyone to park and for guests to park here. Also, I should say that there's two main vehicular access points as well to the east and west of the site. And what this does is it creates this open space in the centre of the site for pockets of shared green space for the people living here to gather and connect. You know, they can grow their own veg. We have some images surrounding this plan, kind of indicative of the kinds of spaces that people could create here. So really an emphasis on pedestrianised streets where kids can play, people's front doors spill onto, and that kind of chats with your neighbours. This is a section that runs through the site. So on the right-hand side here, we have Benefield Road going down to the brook at the end, and you can just see Warren Bridge to the left-hand side of the screen. Obviously, this site slopes down to the south to the stream, and we're well aware that as part of our developing design, we will be putting forward a SUD strategy and a strategy to deal with rainwater on the site and how this is collected and redistributed. But just to say that largely it is two-storey and single-storey bungalows. And we quite consciously place the bungalows to the south side of the site so that we are matching scales similar to Benefield Road, and as we go down the side, consciously stepping down the buildings so that they're sitting in a similar scale to the neighbours. These are some initial impressions we have of the scheme, and this is, if you can imagine, you're standing at the top of Benefield Road looking down towards the brook at the end of the site. And this is the pedestrian lane, so you can see that houses on either side, but it's kind of a green space for people to sit out and chat. And this image shows the kind of east-west pedestrian area. So we have the bungalows to the left-hand side and the terrace houses to the right. This is looking towards Clifton Drive neighbourhood. So you can see shared green spaces here. I'm going to hand over to Meredith and I can talk a bit more about it.
I'm aware that we have a time constraint. We have 3 images which might be worth looking at if there's time, that show the proposal in its context. Hope we can skip them if we've run out of time.
Let's just show them very quickly. I'm conscious of the fact that we have another speaker to talk
Yeah,
about.
no, that's why
We have an entire meeting to get through. So
Absolutely. Well, we don't need to
overrun
spend,
slightly.
we can always come back to them if there are questions later on. So the left hand is the photograph along Benfield Road with a listed terrace on the right hand side. On the right hand side is an image from the same place which shows the terrace of houses which we are proposing at the top of our development facing onto Benfield Road of a similar kind of scale, although dropped down a bit because of the way in which the land falls. On this one, the top image is looking over the allotments, top two images looking over the allotments. The right-hand side just shows where the vehicular access would go in. So it's a largely unchanged or uninterrupted view. On the bottom two are up the west side of Benfield Road, showing the access in, the vehicular access in, and the current situation. So these are early stage drawings. Obviously, this all needs to be worked out in much greater detail. These ones, in a way, don't show very much. This is the closest you can get down the bottom of Clifton Drive, looking from the end of the road past the two dwellings at the lower end of the hill. And on the right-hand side, you can just see, possibly not from where you are, the scale of the similarly scaled houses on the opposite side of the road beyond the parking lane. And on the lower side, these are the houses, as you know, on Warren Bridge. We have had the opportunity today to go into the rear gardens of the owners in order to appreciate the effect that it would have. So we will be updating those with the knowledge of that understanding. So that's it in terms of the presentation.
I'll just pick up the process from here on. So the next 6 months, we'll be looking to develop these plans further. We'll be working with the building group and sort of assembling that group, and obviously working with local residents, hearing thoughts and concerns. We've started that process already. We're at the start of that process, and there will be changes to this plan as we go along, because it will have to adapt and respond to everything that we learn. We'll be doing more work around specifically the engineering elements, especially the water, because we know that's a key issue that we need to address and to understand the ins and outs on. But we'd be hoping to put a planning application in some form forward towards the end of this year. And so I suppose our question to you as town council is any preliminary thoughts, questions, but also the way that you'd like us to work with you as we're going through that process over the coming months. But thank you very much for your time and listening to the presentation this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I think that we also have, looking at the notes, Little Martin.
Yeah.
Who I think has produced this
I have indeed.
paper.
Yes.
Mr. Martin.
Thank you.
Might
Thank you.
allow you a little bit more time than we originally
Oh,
said.
really? Oh, okay. Thank you.
On the basis, I think, of a degree of fairness.
Well, okay, right. Hopefully it won't take me long. You've had sight of the note, which we put together, our groups put together, and we've circulated that to the local community, Benfield Road, Warren Bridge, Clifton Drive, etc. And we've received very supportive responses to our views from all our neighbours, some of whom are here this evening to support further, I believe. I'm just going to lay out the four main points that we make in our note. I'll touch on them briefly if I may. The first one, which we've heard around already, is the development density. The proposal is for 25 houses, which is far greater number than has ever been suggested before in our discussions with Peter, for example. We believe this density has resulted in a design, albeit initial, which is more appropriate for a crowded urban environment than Oundle, which is a rural town anchored in the countryside. As is so well articulated in your own town design statement. Many of the comments we've received have made feelings very explicit on this point, very explicit. This current proposal seems a very long way off from achieving the appropriateness of the overall design to fit into this particular scheme. The density also requires a development that continues towards the bottom of the field, again, which we've seen. And this must, one imagine, and you can see from some of the previous slides, I think, provide privacy issues for some of our neighbours in Warren Bridge. Now, the density of the site in general also leads me on to really important areas which are not directly related to this particular design, and that is the vehicular traffic load. The plan as presented allows for at least 50 vehicles to be parked in two sort of supermarket rows. Whilst no proposals for entry or egress were shown initially, nor how the current bus stops will be fitted in, and I'm presuming this is what we're looking at now. But it's clear that the sheer number of extra vehicles coming onto Benfield Road, which is very, very busy, it's a narrow stretch of Benfield Road where people are parked along, would be extremely problematic and dangerous. A recent traffic count along the site shows that between 400 and 500 vehicles per hour pass this site in peak times. Talking about the flood risk, we've already admitted, I think, that we need to do a lot more work on that. The brook area on the bottom of Millisfield suffers from regular and extensive flooding, encroaching seriously on those houses situated along it and endangering property and safety. It's extremely difficult to see how such risk can be managed in a situation where so many impermeable surfaces will be introduced with no ameliorating runoff provisions, including the current plan. Admitted that's going to be worthwhile. The last point I would make is that I believe that this proposal is going forward under windfall sites in terms of planning is concerned. Now, as far as I understand it, windfall sites are generally accepted, and this is normally in council guidance, that they relate to sites which have been previously developed and also due for development of, say, 5 to 10 houses. Now, 25 houses seems stretching the idea of a windfall site to me, and I know the town went to East Northampton Council and was disappointed, I think, at their initial reaction to how many people, the limit on the windfall sites. And so again, I would ask, the fourth point is, we wonder whether or not using a windfall site application is appropriate in this case. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. I think I'm conscious of the fact it's very nearly 8 o'clock. And my instinct at the moment is to say that we'll put this on the agenda perhaps for our next meeting. And if as a result of that we then have questions of either the residents group or the potential developer or both, we'll work on those, contact you, and then it can either be done in writing or it can be done by another presentation. I'm very conscious of the fact we've got a lot of meeting to get on with. So, provided my colleagues agree with that approach, and if anybody is desperate to ask a question now, I'm not going to stop you, but I think it might almost be easy to do it the way I've suggested. Move. Everybody happy? Okay, well, thank you for those presentations. Much food for thought. It's a very sensitive site in the town. We will look forward to further discussions about it before it comes before planning. Those of you who wish to leave, I'll just break for a couple of minutes because it'll be easier that way from our point of view.
This practice opens up. This practice opens up.
Where did you want this back in the computers?
Bottom one?
Next one up. Yeah, that's fine. Thank
Yeah,
you.
all good.
Thank you very much. You know your way out. Thank you. You know your way out. Thank you. Right. That's been
Things have now returned to something vaguely like normal, as much as there's absolutely nobody here but us. But does not lessen the importance of what follows. Getting back to the agenda, declarations of interests. Anybody got any disposable pecuniary interests in connection with any of the matters we may discussed tonight? No. Any other interests?
No.
Right, minutes of the last planning meeting, that was the one held on the 5th of April. fact in my absence.
That's right.
Councillor Jones, I believe, chaired it, and present were Councillor Jones, Councillor Arnold, and Councillor Chesney, who are with us tonight. Somebody want to propose those minutes, please? Councillor Arnold, seconded, Councillor Chesney, all those in favour? Amen. Bear with me whilst I sign. So it's planning minutes, there usually several pages of them. This will take a while.
Oh, what was I saying?
Technology obviously doesn't want to help. That brings us on to the planning applications. It would be quite handy to manage to get it up. Right. Interestingly enough, I'm sure that when this first came before us, it was described as one station road, which is the listed building, but it now seems to be described as one new road and one station road. I'm not quite sure. I don't think there were two properties. It's still the same one. In our agenda, we set out the principal reasons why there were elements to the original application that we were critical of. And what has happened is that some fresh documentation has now been provided in connection with the application. Now, the fresh documentation is helpful to a degree. And thank you for putting that one up. Because the main change is in connection with the property, which, if you like, you can see on the left-hand side of that drawing. That represents the pair of semi-detached properties which lie fronting New Road and alongside the listed building. And that's essentially moved closer to the listed building to enable the access way to move further away from the junction. Councillors may recall that we were unhappy with the location of the access way previously because of its proximity to the junction, and in fact even went so far as to suggest that potentially access from Bridge View might be more desirable. That response certainly prompted one local resident who put a post on the portal critical of the idea of accessing from Bridge View. The developer has obviously taken that on board, whether it was what we said, whether it's what the planning authority itself may have said to them, who knows. But their response has been to, as I say, to relocate. The issue for us may be this. We worried about the impact of the semi-detached properties off New Road on the listed building. And that was when they were further away. They are now closer to it. On the other hand, one of the other changes that they've made is to remove the door and windows which fronted New Road. They've gone completely, which perhaps certainly gives the impression that the property may be lower than it was, even though it may or may not be. What is slightly disappointing, if you like, is that there are a series of drawings, but not a great deal of extra information in the portal itself. So we can really only go off what we see visually. And I suppose the question for us is, does the change meet our previous concerns? And if not, how do we feel about what is now being proposed? So, thoughts?
I'm trying to work out quite what I'm looking at. Is that Clapthorne Road on the right?
No, let me just come down here.
I'm struggling to.
So this is,
This is New Road.
I see. Are there in a new road?
This is Station Road.
Oh, the wrong place. Yeah.
At the moment, this is Picarthy's garage.
On
Of course,
yeah.
that bit is used as the kind of
That's the ticket. That's the office, isn't it?
kind of office shop area there.
Yeah, I get it. No, so that yes, that is the A427, and that's the bottom of the road.
Absolutely.
I understand. I understand.
I don't know whether the silence is because we're all stuck.
Well, remind me what.
It's
My head's swimming with this one.
Well, just to remind you, the reasons we objected
Yes.
to it were, one, the height and scale and location within the site of the semi-detached properties
Yes.
fronting New Road. We said they should be the same height as the terraced house fronting Station Road nearest the listed building on Station Road. In other words, similar to in height to the ones
Yes.
the other side of the listed building,
Yes.
in order to reduce impact. Because we didn't object to the proposed height of those properties. The other one was the location of the access due to its proximity to the junction of New Road and Station Road.
Oh, I see.
Etc.
Yes. Okay. That large white mass, surely that's park, isn't it? Or is that Garrett? That large white mass at the top.
opposite.
Yeah.
Opposite, it's the Riverside Maltings.
That's molting. Oh, I see. Yes, of course it is. Yes, I see. Yes, of course it is.
It's quite hard to see this drawing because with the grey roofs being the same colour as the road,
Yes.
it makes them less obvious.
So there are 7 new,
Do you know what I mean?
7 new pictures on that slide. Do you want to work your way steadily through each one of the 7?
Yeah. There we are.
So
Well,
there you see it looking as it were along Station Road coming into town. You see that the first of the terraced houses is at a slightly lesser height than the other ones, all of which have the dormer windows. Then you've got the listed building kind of sitting practically centre stage, and then round the corner you have the semi-detached properties. Now, it may just be a trick of the way that looks as if marginally it's a little taller than the other one, but that may or may not be an optical illusion just given the drawing. Do you want to move through?
1, 2, 3.
So that's just another view of the terrace. You'll see the steps nature of that, which we didn't have a problem with before.
What's the range of bedrooms in these houses?
So the two sort of nearest the listed building are two, I believe, two bedroom, and the other ones are 3 bedroom. I think I'm right.
Let me see if I can
Three-story.
I'll see if I can work it out.
floor plan.
I seem to remember a concern I had was that they were going to put sort of luxury homes on here, which would be,
Right.
unobtainable really.
Right,
that
terrace
doesn't
of
seem
6 houses, 4 3-bedrooms, 2 2-bedrooms.
Yeah.
As far as I know, that composition hasn't changed at all.
I think that's ultimately a good thing.
Type A, type B.
Right. I think that if you go to, because I think
Which one do you
they're
want?
probably the original drawings, if you go more to the sort of street scene ones at the top.
Who's that? Stop.
Street scene at the top.
Yeah, because you'll see that they're all 8th of April.
Yeah.
So
How do
you'll
I
see
make it
these little-
smaller?
Trying to zoom out.
I go up and down for some reason, I don't know why.
You're not, some sort of leaning on a keyboard, is it somewhere?
Oh,
Sometimes that might do it.
oh
There
yeah.
you go, yeah.
Right, what one do you want to
When in
look
doubt,
at,
try the
David?
August. Well, I'm just thinking, you'll see that
Amended
there
floor
are a
plans
number of, well, you've got the proposed, don't think the proposed landscape plan, but I think there's a proposed, the new site plan
This one, yeah.
there, and then it's the 7 drawings. So there's the site plan, and you, again, it gives you the sort of impression you've got the semi-detached property near to the listed property, you've got the entrance coming in slightly further up, and you've got all the parking spaces essentially down the side, more or less behind the listed building, behind the terrace properties, but to the parking spaces you'll notice on the far side of the access road, which I think are for the semi-detached properties at the top.
For me, that all looks like a good solution. I think it's exactly the kind of site that we want as a brownfield site. It's housing which isn't, still out of reach. On that base of it certainly feels a little bit more comfort and joy than some of the other sites that are being built on in town.
I guess the issue that worries me about it is when you look at our original objections,
Yeah.
whilst perhaps the location of the access is marginally improved by what's happening,
Yeah.
there are constraints, because you can see from that site diagram, you can't really move it very much further up the road, there's nowhere else for it to go. So that's as good as it gets.
Yeah.
But that has the impact of moving that other property
Yeah, it's a listed.
nearer to the listed building. And I must admit, what instantly struck me when I looked at that was, just imagine that scene without that.
Yeah.
Semi-detached properties at all. So you've got the 6 terrace houses
Absolutely.
running down Station Road, you've got the listed building, and then you've got a nice open space next to the listed building.
Yeah.
in fact.
I think, for my money, I think it should be on, is it Bridge Road? The other.
The Bridge View is-
Bridge
yeah.
View. I think it should connect there. The road, there shouldn't be an end building, like you just said. And then potentially, although I'm no architect, there's scope to put that end building somewhere else for.
What should connect with Bridge View?
Sorry, what's
the name?
Yes, what bothers me,
If you think it was, just to try and sort of make it, there's a turning point ahead,
Yeah,
and if we go back to that site plan. to
This
the
one?
top,
This one here.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that it is possible
What are you hoping for?
to there, you see the top.
you see, you've got Bridge View coming round here,
Yeah,
and it would appear
you could get in
that
there.
you could get in there.
Yeah, I see.
So you could either have, well, you could also get in at the bottom end, but arguably better there.
Yeah,
And then you could conceivably not have an entrance at the top at all.
Yeah.
Now, we know that at least one person has expressed concern about that. It may well be that they live in one of these properties, or that one, I have no idea who would be the most affected by it. But it does seem to be potentially an option to gain access off there. And if you did lose that as well, then the impact on this, of course, is considerably less.
I think it was Councillor David who pointed out that actually, if you just go up a bit, Peter. It's that I know they've moved it slightly further, but cars coming around that corner from from Station Road,
From here.
from the sort of from Waitrose sort of way, it's quite blind going around there, especially if there's
Especially if you're coming
out.
As you say,
Exactly.
that way around, you're relatively soon upon it, less soon under this plan than the one that had it over here.
Yeah.
Of course, I suppose if you didn't have the roadway at all, those could move back further across this way again.
And also, we should point out, the recreation park is next to that. And then there are a lot of, there will be in when it's summer, a lot of kids coming and going.
That's the point I was trying to make, that there will be a lot of mothers with prams and pushchairs. And it's terrible around that corner at the present time, because Picarthy park all their cars all over that sort of triangular shaped bit in front. Do you see the white bit?
Yeah.
So I was going to ask, is this drawn accurately in terms of the size of do you see what I mean? Because it would be easier to make it look like the access was.
I mean, it is presumably drawn to scale, and just thinking about it, it looks, from memory, roughly right.
Yeah, but it's jolly close, isn't it?
But it's still
The
close.
entrance to the wreck, that's really
I suppose I prefer the emphasis
Really
to come
want
through Bridge View. However, I suppose the problem is if you do connect it to Bridge View at that bit there, the spaces might sort of become free game for anyone that lives in Bridge View. So it's having the access from New Road keeps the car parking spaces to them. I suppose that was one of the thoughts about that. About the two houses at the top being close to a listed building. I feel we have to remember this listed building was once surrounded by a petrol station, so I'm not particularly bothered about how two nice new houses look in relation to it. It's infinitely better than a petrol station. So I think that's a red herring. But yeah, you're right about that road. I prefer to see the access through Bridge.
I mean, given your comment about what if residents of Bridgeview or their guests park there, one way, those bollards that you can click up, a key to, I suppose they could be fitted with that, so that the residents have keys which would stop at any interlopers parking.
That'd be a cost to the residents there, wouldn't it? They'd have to pay for the.
That would be presumably a small fee, but it might be a relatively small price to pay.
Yeah.
So Councillor Jones isn't too worried about the
Two houses.
proximity of the semi-detached properties to the listed building. Whilst I take his point, the reality is that it becomes an opportunity to kind of free up the listed building from the impact of buildings around it, and to some degree restore it to its full glory. But
Understood.
what views do
Well,
Councillors Chester
I have
and
to say,
Water?
my worry about it now, because of the flared nature of the exit, which has got to be in order to get in and out, it's very close to the entrance to the wreck, where there will be a lot of children and a lot of young
It's a normal road to think about
cyclists, the
crossing.
footballers go there, the skate park, it's a skate park as well, right by the entrance, skate park and the children's. The young children's section.
I agree firmly with Councillor Chester on that. I think safety is pivotal there, paramount.
Any view on whether or not
I like the idea of the smallness of the development. You know, I think I quite like the idea of just a few houses together in that way. I think
So are you a 6 or an 8 person, if I can put it that way?
I don't care. I don't care really, but I do worry about. I'm not massively keen on the semi-detached. I think I don't know what sort of point they're trying to make with those.
I suppose the reality is to get 2 more houses on there and make an additional profit
Yeah.
out of having them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's total consensus. I think there's fairly good consensus over the fact that the access is still problematic even there, and our preference is still for access to be gained off Bridge View.
Yeah.
And I think the question of the impact, I suppose what one could say is that if those properties were there, given our previous concerns about impact on the listed building and presumably moving it closer, runs the risk of impact, a greater impact, though we know the attempts have been made to ameliorate that by removing, for example, the windows, maybe to simply flag up that if the roadway isn't there, the opportunity to move them back again, further, as it were, away from the listed building would then exist. And I suppose we could leave it at that. Councillors are happy with that approach?
Yeah.
Right. I rather suspect that's when you're going to tell me, could I write it up? Okay. I will do that. Something that's a little less complicated. Tree works to trees subject to a tree preservation order of Herne Lodge, work to sundry sycamores and a lime tree. It did strike me looking at it that it seems to fit as well as anything that does to a matter of tree husbandry where our normal approach is not to object.
Husbandry is fine.
Okay.
They never seem to stop though, do they? Doing stuff to the trees.
To the trees on that
the biggest thing
area.
on that development. in that area.
It is, and certainly if there's any issue of trying to fell anything, I'm sure it'd be.
Yeah, it looks as if they're trying to sort of fell by stealth.
Let's just keep an eye on the situation. So the next one is interesting. It's 35 North Street, and it's a single-storey rear extension, replacement window and rain water grids. Listed building consent, because this is a late 17th century Grade 2 listed property. It's listed jointly with number 41. As I put in my note, forms part of an important street scene. Now, interestingly, there is a history to this, because back in 2018, consent was given for a single-storey rear extension, but that work was actually never undertaken. According to the design and access statement, what is now proposed is actually an extension slightly smaller than that which had been proposed in 2018, one of only 3 metres in depth, basically creating a shower room and utility space at ground floor level, and some additional storage space. The applicant says that the LBC application is not submitted with an application for full planning permission as expected, on the basis the extension could be constructed under permitted development rights. I'm not entirely sure he's right, but I suppose that's a matter that the planning authority will certainly know. So what I would be tempted to say about it is that we note that the applicant says that this is the case, without actually saying that they are either right or wrong about that. They point out in the design and access statement that none of the features that are actually referred to in the listing of the building are actually going to be affected by what's proposed. Material natural coarse stone, roof will be slate, an existing window, which the applicant describes as being in poor condition and non-original, will be replaced with a purpose-made timber unit with flush-fitting casements, and the PVC guttering replaced with something rather interesting. The County Archaeological Advisor, interestingly enough, had no comment to make. English Heritage, almost as usual, had no comment to make. They just tend to sort of put out a very bland response to most of these things, so actually talk to your conservation officer. Some obvious points, I suppose. It doesn't appear that, certainly from the street scene, what is proposed is going to be visible. My inclination would be to say that if what is proposed doesn't upset the conservation officer, then probably we wouldn't object. But we would want the conservation officer to make sure that what the applicant says about the window being non-original and in poor condition is actually correct, because it was an original window, but in poor condition. Of course, we might be saying every effort should be made to restore it and keep as much of the original material as possible, though I suspect they're right in terms of what they say about it. I'm not sure there's anything very much else I can add. Any thoughts?
Do we know what the previous roof?
The rest of the roof, according again to the paperwork, is slate. In other words, it's not Collie Western
Right.
on the rest of it, and then they want to put a slate extension in.
Yeah, that's what I was.
It may very well have been Collie Western at one time in the past. I suspect it probably was. When it got altered, I don't know, but it appears that it's a slate one now. So I think it would be difficult to insist on putting it in Collie Western.
Oh, yeah.
In those
So just ask the question.
But it's a fair question to ask and one I always look at.
When you said it doesn't appear to be visible from the front, it can't possibly be visible from the front, if I got that right, 'cause is it going out to the rear or the back?
Yes, it's a rear extension.
And it's a terrace house, right? So,
It's a terraced property.
yeah.
And although I think there might be some sort of a passageway, I don't really hope you could see it. Unless I'm confusing this one with a different one. But I don't think
there's a
that-
passageway around it.
Perhaps it's a different one. I was
Oh,
thinking.
there is, I think.
May not even be one on this.
There's
This
three houses
particular-
before it, there's a passageway. It's primarily they've got one there, and that's going towards Waitrose.
Move on to Google
Yeah.
the street view so you can get it. And overhead view.
So it comes up.
Um,
I mean, like, if it's a single story rear extension, honestly, yeah, unless the windows issues and notices real, I can't see a problem for myself.
Agreed.
So effectively, it's no objection subject to any contrary view of the conservation
Yeah.
officer, but make the point about the window. You want that checking. And we just highlight the fact that it comes without a full plan application.
It's the one that's actually got a gangway in the middle.
That's it.
That's
Legal sentiment. But the reality is, I don't think even if you stood in the entranceway and peered down there, you'd be able to see what's proposed, let alone see it as you walk in the street. So essentially, it's no objection subject to. Oops. So the next one, a single line tree at 109 Glapthorne Road. Now, this one, there is a photograph on the portal showing a very large lime tree with an awful lot of vegetation. And the vegetation hangs so low that it almost completely conceals the road sign. So they talk about raising the tree by 4 metres to allow clearance to vehicles and the signage, and I assume what they mean is that road sign.
When they just
So-
got raised, you mean cutting off the side branches?
I think yes,
to
in
allow
effect,
point?
yes. It's the way it's described, and as usual, you don't get an awful lot of information in tree works. This one, I think, is Nen Valley Trees, who put in this particular application. And there's your picture. And somewhere, as you can see, there's a road sign there. As to what it is,
I think it's this one,
nobody knows,
road humps.
but it's quite difficult. Yes.
Someone's-
Councillor Jones usefully produces a photograph of the tree not in leaf.
Yes, that's right. Wow.
And when the tree is not in leaf, you can actually see the road sign. However, as is apparent from that, you can't, as things currently stand. It does seem to me that there's no obvious reason to object to that.
Agreed.
70 Benfield Road. There seems to be a pattern developing with our applications tonight, in as much as people keep applying for things that they've already previously had permission for. And this is a similar scenario. So 70 Benfield Road, alterations to the design of a double garage approved under Planning Commission 11899, including the use of the loft space of the home study area. And essentially what the applicant points out is that in 2000, says here in 2010, well, the number says 2010, planning approval given for works at the property which included the construction of a double garage. Essentially what happened is they did all the other works, but they never built the double garage. So they now want to apply anew for permission for a double garage. It's slightly larger than the one previously approved, simply because it needs to be because of current highway standards for garages. They say that instead of the materials previously approved, and I must admit I did not go back to try and find it from 2010, the garage would be constructed from coarse limestone with slate roof, so it sounds as if it's a solid looking construction, presumably of similar material to the property. New plan provides for access to the loft space of the garage roof. The first thing I thought when we read that is, does this mean we're going to have one of those external staircases again? And the answer is no, we're not. Internal staircase, which was enabled to be fitted out as stone. And essentially, in that sort of top left-hand corner, you can see the staircase sort of top edge of it. And at the bottom is the study area and a sort of small storage area, I think, as well. What they go on to say is that there'll be a traditional casement window at first floor level, because of creating an open study, with opening below the southern elevation above the double doors with roof lights on the side elevations. So to try and get as much natural light in there as possible, I suppose. They suggest that the access to the garage off the Pexley Court is in line with the access previously proposed for the previously approved garage. They're not proposing to put two cars in it, they're actually proposing to put a car and then dinghy in it. And they say that there's parking space for two further cars on block paving in front of the garage. There doesn't seem, I have to say, to me, anything in that application likely to cause us any great concern.
So is it going behind the house? Behind it, there's this on Pexley Court, there's a sort of strange sort of single garage on its own.
Yeah, I think you'll find.
So that's the
that
house, and if you go behind.
Yeah. I was trying to, yeah, you're right, it reminds me.
There's this.
When I looked at it, I think that potentially that single garage is going to be replaced with a double garage.
It looks a bit like that, doesn't it? It's the same shape.
There's something, but it doesn't actually put in a planning application for the demolition of single garage and construction of. But I think you're exactly right. I think that is what is planned, to get rid of a single garage, replace with a double garage.
Yeah.
But actually, in effect, create an entire extra room for home.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know.
It's all right.
I couldn't see any of these issues. As I say, there were no comments on.
The wasteland otherwise.
No objection. The next one is 1 Mildmay Close, single-storey side extension in addition to the front porch. And guess what? There was a previous planning permission expecting this one as well.
I think they've changed hands. There's not been any spare houses throughout COVID in Oundle. People have been desperate.
Yes,
So
marketing
could be
Oundle is
new
desperate.
owners to.
Tell me about it. Of course, has been trying to buy a house in Oundle for ages without any success at all. So, single-storey side extension, addition of a front porch. Both extension and porches were built in brick to match the existing, slate roofs also to match, windows and doors UPVC to match. Extension would have 2 skylights at the rear, 1 at the front. On the front elevation would be a triple window, to the rear a glazed double doors, so a French door have. The extension would have had a downstairs ensuite bedroom and a second lounge. Porch will have a pitched roof. All that's a bit more obvious if you look at the drawings and such. Just wondering if there's something a little bit on that. Yeah, good. So I think that's. Yeah, so there's the porch in the front. You can see there with the pitched roof in the front door. And over to the side, you see this extension. It's got that kind of triple window at the front. You can see a single roof light there. And at the other end, you have double door. So if you look at the extension from the opposite end, you've got double doors. I think you've got a double roof light. The only thing I couldn't tell without going up there to look, and I just never found the time to go and do it, is whether by building out a porch like that, suddenly it's out of line with all the other properties in terms of a building line. But you've only got to drive anywhere around there. There's so many porches that are being tacked onto properties. Go up and down New Road, for example, there are several like that, and it seems quite nicely done. My only kind of other comment, which I put on here, is that we can see that they're going to add a bedroom. What unfortunately they don't tell us is how many bedrooms it's already got, or anything therefore about the number of parking spaces required. It does, however, seem to me, from what one can tell, that it's likely to require a total of 3 parking spaces. But there's not a lot in terms of the drawings that would help you work it out. Whether your Google view.
Trying to work out if that's it, it's quite hard to tell. I think it might be that orange one. If it's got a joined garage with the house next door. No.
As far as I could tell.
Is there a way to work out which house it is? There's many different houses. That's number 10. Google says it's that one.
This is
number 1.
number 1.
So Google wants to tell me it's that one. So
Not quite right.
No.
From the point of view of this sort of joined up double garage.
that is, yeah, so if it's looking at that picture there, so it says it's the one on the right hand side, which is actually the blue one.
In which case, it's to the left hand side of this, isn't it? So that does kind of work. Now, in terms of the amount of car parking, there's not a great deal because, frankly, you get a car in the garage, you get a car in front of the garage, short of being able to park on what is currently a grassed area in front of it, where to some extent you're going to have your porch area sticking into it.
Yeah, that's what they're thinking.
There might be an issue around whether there's frankly enough on-site parking to add an extra bedroom to the property. Highways, of course, usefully don't say anything other than to put up their usual thing about what minimum parking standards are, but don't actually comment on whether this property does or doesn't comply with them, or at least it hasn't done up to now. But that would be the only possible issue, and I suppose it's
Well,
relatively
we can make a
easy
comment to that.
to flag it, that we have some concern as to whether or not there is sufficient parking on site, given the addition of the extra legroom. And just leave it at that. Yeah. So, concern the parking.
Imagine it's really a 3-bedder.
Yeah, I would guess it's a 3-bedroom property already, so it wouldn't, you get to a sort of cut-off point where it doesn't seem that how many bedrooms you've got. The highway standard basically says parking spaces for 3 cars, but there again, in the report it says about garages not generally representing a parking space.
Don't
Yes.
wait for it.
So that brings us on to Prince William School. There were so many documents in connection with this application that I have to say I kept my little, as it were, briefing note brief. So the proposal is going to provide 2031, I didn't measure it, I simply took the figures for gospel, square metres of education and community use space. The existing sports hall, with which I suspect you're all familiar, would be replaced by a new hall, almost slightly over twice as big, going from 339 square metres to 695 square metres. According to the planning statement, that's one of the documents lodged with all of this, that's larger than a standard size sports hall. The applicant does say in there that it's to Sport England standards, but I have to say that Sport England have put a very, very long post on the portal. The gist of which seems to be that the applicant got so far with talking to them and then seemed to have stopped talking to them, if I read it right, and therefore I'm not sure that Sports England are convinced that what is proposed does actually comply with what they would want, albeit that the applicant, the school obviously, is saying that it does. We also got a dance studio, you might say yet another one, a fitness studio, some male and female changing rooms. I did almost feel like saying, in these days, you have a male and a female changing room. Should we not be having? No, I'm not going there. And an ICT classroom for school pupils, plus a 1,089 square metre pupil plaza. I think we used to call it a school playground or a school yard in my day, providing a new external space for informal play. There'll also be a new entrance building, a visitor reception, and a reconfigured car park and bus area. This is to increasing size. Now, they seem to be saying that it increased by 1,692 square metres, which sounds pretty large, pretty vast actually. Although they go on to say that there'll be a marginal decrease in parking capacity from 161 to 159 cars, but they also put all sorts of information in there to say that they've got researched how many cars they generally get, and they don't get up to even 159 at all. And the idea is that by reconfiguring it, it basically enables them to put in things like crossings and generally make movement on site safer for pupils, given that there's a certain amount of interrelationship between pupils and cars, shall we say. I did put on there that the police community safety, although they weren't actually saying they objected, did make a number of observations and suggestions and what perhaps down to improve matters. And you'll see there that I put Sport England doesn't consider sufficient information has been provided to enable it to respond, but then goes on and makes a number of preliminary observations on it. I rather suspect that this is one of those where we would welcome the improvement to the facilities Prince William, which I noted in the paperwork now apparently has 1,750 pupils, which makes it a kind of mega school, quite frankly. That is a very large number, and that's before, of course, we get 260 straight 300 odd extra housing in Oundle that we're likely to have sooner rather than later. I don't know whether people have looked at the material on the site. As I say, there's an awful lot of stuff in there, and it's quite difficult to work your way through and actually take a view. And I rather came to the sort of opinion that we might just simply want to welcome improved facilities and leave it to the technical experts to decide if there are any specific issues. Other than that, to make an observation that we hope that the helpful comments of the police and community safety are taken on board, and that we would want to ensure that it is built to properly in accordance with sporting specification. That's happy with that? Basically, what I can see is that I'm going to work my way through most of these applications and send you
I
some.
think you're quite right to hold them to the highest standards as we can there, because, you know, the custodians of the young people in this town as well, you know, how great to have two amazing sports facilities at two schools in this town.
Yes,
The exceptional, you know, it needs to be sporting standards.
So, the last two things on the agenda are there for information only. I haven't bothered to spend time looking at them due to a lack of time, and also being conscious of the fact that we've got other matters on our agenda that can take us a few minutes. So the last one is the Cotterstock Road development. Given our general hostility to this application, I was tempted to say we reject in principle, but actually we moved it. So they're looking for what they describe as 3 stacked signs, 8 flags and signage. And there's some pretty sort of little diagrams and drawings of the proposed notices and flags and the rest of it. So either side of the entrance to the site of Cotterstock Road, there would be a stacked sign and 3 very tall flagpoles on each side, 5,000 high. The signs themselves are given the dimensions of, and the flags are given the dimensions of, except the flagpoles are even higher than the signage. There's a further stacked sign between 2 flags just into the site, because broadly speaking, if you come off Cotterstock Road, you've barely got into the site, where there's a garage that's currently going to be used as a sales office, and then there's going to be a show home effectively behind that. And what they're doing is putting some little flags and a sign there as well. If that had been in a slightly different location, I would be more worried about the height of some of this stuff. But actually, given where it is, its impact is lessened. Anybody?
We don't have any problems with it.
No, are we going to see them across the whole of town? I mean, when you see them from Waitrose, for example.
That's one of the difficulties that I have, trying to imagine the size of these things. If you think about it, they're going to be quite tall. But, for example, say you're driving into coming down the A605 from Peterborough, and you look to your right, and actually the top end of that development is an awful long way away. I would doubt that the flags would look particularly intrusive from there, or from anywhere else. But I suspect that, for example, you might well be able to see them from, say, perhaps Smith Meadow.
I don't think.
But
I think you see them coming from Warmington on the road. I think you probably see them from Blackthorn. I mean, and who are they for? So,
well, obviously they're there to tell the world,
Attention.
we've got a jolly big housing development,
Yeah.
and we want you to come along and buy nice houses. It
Yeah,
has
that's
no intrinsic merit, obviously they're temporary structures, they should be a condition clearly that requires their removal. But that probably will be once the last house in the development is sold, which suggests that once they're up, they will be there for some time in the number of properties that are going to be constructed.
Are we allowed to?
So we could say that we think that given the height and the general dimensions that they're kind of overpowering, we think that they should be, whilst we wouldn't object, we would want them significantly smaller. After all, you might argue, it's fine to draw attention to the site to anybody driving on the Cotterstock Road itself, but they don't need to be that big in order to do it.
No.
And they
Outside
certainly
school,
don't
for goodness
arguably
sake.
need to be that big outside the sales office
No.
when you've already had to drive past the big signs in order to enter the site.
That's right, yes. You know, it's by a school, it's going to get plenty of attention.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's not as if it's on a road that passing traffic goes down anyway, because it's the road to Cotterstock, it's not the main road to Warmington. So they serve no purpose except for just being, well, it depends where they're going to be, I suppose, but.
Well, there is a diagram which shows their location, but as I say, if you imagine the site entrance, and just imagine to either side of the site entrance, you've got these signboards, if you like, and then you've got three of these quite tall flags. Why it needs three? Again, you might say, well, isn't one enough?
They've got three things to say from looking at the flags. So
Yeah,
one-
they've got different, slightly different messages on each, but is that okay?
I think so. I don't like the flags. Any of the signage, actually.
Well, why don't we indicate that we feel that
It's excessive.
they're too high,
Yeah.
the dimensions are all wrong, the numbers are all wrong,
Mm.
and arguably you don't need that degree of signage once you've entered the site, in any event. And the thing should be visible from the Cotterstock Road, but essentially it doesn't need to be visible from anywhere else.
No, that's right.
Yes, and we can talk about proportion of the surrounding
Yes,
countryside.
well, I mean, obviously you're right on the border of the countryside there. It was countryside until they started digging it up. All right. So as I say, the next two are purely to note, but I'm not going to spend any time on it because it's already gone tonight. You'll see the various planning outcomes. Interestingly enough, we didn't object to the Thames Road, proposed single-bedroom bungalow, as it were within the curtilage of the existing dwelling. That's been withdrawn. I suspect it'll come back in some revised format. Other matters, I think, were granted, although you may recall that when we first looked at the 3 Benfield Court application, we didn't object. Then various residents came and made a presentation to us and thought it was appropriate to think about it again. Then we did object, and it has been refused, and it does seem as if it was refused on sort of grounds that we were putting forward, i.e. its visual impact from Stoke Road, for example. You'll also notice a planning appeal. These things never fail to surprise you, do they? This wasn't one of those things that were all exercised and objected to and everything else. We hadn't actually objected to this application in the first place. And it was refused, and the applicant took it to appeal, and that's been dismissed as well. There we go. The last substantive matter on this agenda is the Northamptonshire Strategic Plan Scope and Issues Consultation. it says to consider it to decide the next steps. Those of you who were present at the town meeting will have heard me talk about it a bit. The consultation opened on the 28th of March. It closes on the 23rd of May. So the reality is it closes before this committee meets again. But after the, I think I'm right in saying after the
Full council.
full council meeting, which I think is going to be. The document itself is, I can't now remember whether it was 53 or 58 pages long, but it's that sort of order of things. And essentially, it poses a series of questions, and I set it out in the document I circulated, I think, prior to the full council meeting. And there are a whole series of questions in there. Now, this is the sort of thing which you could spend many a happy hour looking at, or not as the case may be. Now, some of the questions in here, for example, really aren't matters that we're likely to take a view on. For example, question 27, what should the future role of Rushton Lakes and other out-of-town centre locations be? Well, we don't really have any. Rushton Lakes is obviously not on our doorstep. Out-of-town centre locations, well, I suppose you could talk about them, but it's not a major issue. But there obviously are areas in here which are going to be relevant. The actual plan will focus on a range of things, the spatial vision for North Northamptonshire, the approach to climate change, we can understand that, the approach to levelling up, which is quite interesting, the spatial strategy for the distribution and development, in other words, where are we going to actually build it, the housing requirement, how much have we got to build, economic growth, town centres, strategic development locations and opportunities, read the document, infrastructure, placemaking stroke sustainable development, and natural and historic environment. You get to look at the words historic environment, immediately start thinking about it applies to us. And then there are these range of questions. And essentially they say, are we asking all the right questions? Not are we asking the right questions in the right order, but are we asking the right questions? Now, it may be that we ultimately have a view that they are asking all the right questions, or it may be that our view is that some of the questions are not the right questions, or that certain questions that should be being asked aren't being asked at all. And I highlighted two issues at the town meeting that struck me instantly when I went through it all. One was, it's all very well saying infrastructure. We have a very specific issue in this town. We've recently made a great play of it in terms of the public examination of the local plan part 2. Thank you, Councillor Rycroft, for that, and for the work you've been doing on it. But there, should we be actually asking them to look much more closely at the adequacy of medical provision on the basis that if it isn't there, it would seem to suggest that you shouldn't be putting extra residential development there unless you can guarantee that the medical facilities will come on stream either before the development itself or as the development comes on stream, so does the extra facility. So there's that issue, which I particularly noted. And the other one which I thought perhaps was of some relevance to this council was the issue of coalescence. We have the anomaly of 3 developments in various locations, quote unquote, in Oundle, which technically are not in Oundle at all. The first of those to emerge was on the old A1 reclaim site, the old railway station area, which everybody thinks is in Oundle, no doubt including probably most of the residents, but it's technically in Ashton. Those of us who've been around on the council long enough will recall that at one time when we looked at parish boundary reviews, we suggested that logic said that should be part of Oundle, as indeed should the riverside, because essentially everything this side of the A605 roundabout outside the town should be part of the town. That promptly upset Ashton because, of course, it would have had an impact upon them because they would have ceased to have a council and they would have had to have had a parish meeting. Then, more recently, we got the development of Old Farm Close. That's the development as you go out of Oundle towards Suffolk, that is on your left-hand side, right at the edge of Oundle, except that it isn't Oundle, it's in Gladstone. When that one came up, we objected to it, saying you shouldn't be building platform right up to Oundle, and it got permission anyway. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, of course, we also now know that the site of Gotterstock Road, St Peters Road, is split between the parishes of Blackthorn and Oundle, but nobody seems to be actually recognising the truth of that. And therefore, you're going to have a lot of houses built technically in Blackthorn Parish, alongside houses that are actually going to be in Oundle. Everybody's going to think they're in Oundle. It's totally remote from the environment of Blackthorn. Now, those things are nonsenses, and they will probably be addressed, I would say, at issues around boundary review, which is a matter for another day, but one that can't be dodged indefinitely. But it then does beg the issue of coalescence. And if you think about where Oundle is, you've got the possibility of further development around the marina area, which just happens to be in Barnwell and not in Oundle. And what perhaps is arguably most worrying in some ways, because it's potentially the most likely, is that there is not that much in terms of agricultural land now between where Gladthorn Village starts and Old Farm Close is. Now, we know that Gladthorn has a neighbourhood plan, we know what it says about coalescence and to keep distinct from Oundle. I rather suspect that we'd like to keep distinct from the village. There is nothing that I could see specifically on this whole coalescence issue. And it does seem to me as if planners view coalescence in a different way to how certainly I view it, and I rather suspect members of the public view it, who probably quite simplistically just look at it and say, why have they built that there? It's in the wrong place. And if you build it somewhere where inevitably, sooner or later, you'll get pressure to alter parish boundaries to accommodate it, it seems to me there's something wrong with the system. So personally, I have to stress that, in a sense, what I've just said on both issues and on personal views at this stage, I think that that's another issue that we could and should be looking at. Of course, there is a practical issue, and that is that we don't actually have all that long to deal with. Quite often, when these sorts of things come up, I say to the committee, look, I'll prepare you a paper and I'll produce it in time, and you can hopefully look at it and say, very good, and either rubber stamp it or hopefully approve it with minimal tweaks. I can't say I can't get it done in that time scale. I certainly can't get it done in the way I'd ideally like to, because the time scales are too tight. It is, after all, less than 3 weeks away. But I can certainly if you like, produce something, and we could aim to try and put it on the full council agenda, which is, after all, on Tuesday week, which is not very far away. Since the reality is probably that I'd have to end up doing it on the weekend immediately before that. I'm sure I'm going to have any time to do it otherwise. But of course, it doesn't have to be me. We have an entire committee. We have an interested councillor here as well. And it may well be that you have views yourselves on those questions and on the issue of further questions. And of course, it would be perfectly possible for us to, for example, say, look, if anybody's got any bright ideas, email the chair of the committee with the said bright ideas, and the chair can factor those into whatever ends up getting produced. Because the reality has got to be, I suppose, that we put something together, put it to full council, and assuming that full council goes along with it, then we can actually put in something. And my view is that although this is in the very early stages, and when we're going to get much more excited is when they start actually telling us where the next draft of development is going to be in town, actually, we should be getting excited from the outset to say, get your plan right first. So this isn't about where the development should be, that's a question for another day. This is simply about the surrounding issues that we need to be looking at. So I've talked for some time. Does anybody have any contributions, views, suggestions as to where we go from here with it? That's all right.
Thank you, Mr. Capel. Having tried to get my head around all the earlier papers and scrutinised your very helpful summary of the consultation document, I think our best bet for Oundle is good is for you to prepare a paper for the full council, a draft for full council response to this stage, flagging up key issues that we see relevant. Coalescence, certainly, re-emphasising powerfully that infrastructure needs to keep full pace with any future developments. And lastly, I think any other particular issues that you see as relevant. Given that, provided we're clear on the outset what we want in particular, and perhaps to some extent what we don't want, definitely, like feeble attempts at coalescence, exemplified by those three cases surrounding us now, then I think we're well placed to respond powerfully to the further stages as they come along.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is I think that as a committee and as a council, I think it's important that we have a sort of united front, a united idea, but there are questions in here that I personally sort of wouldn't mind finding more out about, or asking them what they intend to do about, for example, affordable housing, things like that. So I think, yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, no difficulty. And frankly, Mr. Chairman, colleagues, I think how things developed, first of all, our mishap really on our neighbourhood plan, followed by the progression of the local plan and how things went forward. In a sense, perhaps, of course, the good coming out of evil, I think sharpened our minds on real implications of the whole. All too long, probably for honourable reasons, because infrastructure usually in other parts of the country has more or less kept pace with development. I think planners, planning officers, who are honourable ladies and gentlemen, professionals, have rather fallen too much into the mindset of the late General de Gaulle, who's famous, who had a sweeping almost contempt for supplies and reinforcements, which he summed up in this expression, "La tombe suivra," the baggage train follows. In the case of those three surrounding sites around Oundle, it's certainly not. There's of course the medical practice next door, struggling, on which I reported fully, and there are clear indications that Anglian water is struggling to catch up. And there won't be the only ones. So lessons, I think, are being learned all around, and also I reckon that our Northamptonshire councillors will definitely want to put their best feet forward and take an active interest from the word go, and as the processes take their course.
For me, having looked at those questions a couple of times, I've just become aware that I'm a layman, really. With some of the things those questions ask, I struggle even to wonder what my answer would ever be to them. And so in light of that, I can only really revert back to what caused me to the chain of events that led to me being on this council. And it was a deep concern for our environmental situation. And so the only contribution I feel like I could make or want to be seen is something along the lines of the critical state we're in and the need to protect our natural environment. I am dismayed to see, thinking ahead again about where we're going to build and where we're going to urbanise and how we're going to do that. It's a deep concern to me, and so I would hope that anything that we do put together, whether I have a part of it or not, would seek to protect at all costs the natural environment that we have in Northamptonshire.
I don't have anything to say. I'm going to try and work my way through the list.
Well,
Right,
try
tiny
and
little comments.
get the document up itself.
Yeah.
Because it sets obviously those questions in context. All I've actually done is lift them because they're all actually there and flagged up and running and so on. And it is a bit difficult and dry to just plough your way through it. And you look at things and think, well, should the plan seek to introduce biodiversity net gains above the mandated 10% in line with the Oxford-Cambridge Park target of 20%? And I think I am completely incapable of offering a view on anything like that, as would be 99% of the people who would be likely to respond. But it is interesting, isn't it, that what gets flagged up around the table is infrastructure in its various forms, its coalescence, it's to ensure a supply of affordable housing, and it's to ensure that where development has to take place, it does so in the most environmentally sensitive way possible, which will obviously include things like, where possible, developing brownfield sites rather than greenfield sites. Although then you, of course, look at Oundle and you think, well, one brownfield site's being developed as Waitrose, another brownfield site we've just been looking at today. There aren't actually that many more brownfield sites that you could actually look at and say.
But it just leads me to what's balancing possible government policy, because it all just seems to be about building. And I want to know the figures why there needs to be so much building rather than improvement of stock? Why aren't we talking about improvement of stock? Why isn't that on any kind of documentation that comes towards us? It's all about where to dig up next. And I find that just so
I think that's a good point, actually.
So good is it that I've just added in most of things, improvement of housing stock. Again, I don't recollect that anything in those questions reflecting in quite those terms, but it does seem a reasonable question to say, could some of the housing need be met by improvements to existing housing stock rather than simply relentlessly building new properties on what inevitably in rural areas are bound to be greenfield sites?
I have a concern about dormitories. And Fratton's very much a dormitory, and Oundle's pretty much a dormitory, because half the year our children aren't here, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, none of the questions seem to be addressing things about what shape we want our particular community to be. So obviously the builders want to put houses up in nice places. They can come to Oundle and say, isn't this a lovely place? We'd like to build some houses here. They don't look at whether there's any jobs for the people, so the people come and buy them, and then they commute.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely so.
And, you know, that's not being addressed. Those are the things we also want to look at.
It's another good point. Right, well, unless anybody has anything else, I think that's given us all some food for thought. I will see what I can put together. I kind of keep open my offer if anybody gets any bright ideas or wordings for specific questions or what have you, by all means let me have them. And I will do what I can, if I can, to put something together for full council. And if you could tell Emma to put it on the agenda for the next full council meeting if you haven't written that down already.
Which is on the 17th, so it's two weeks yesterday, isn't it? Yeah.
Right, that brings us to any other matters to report. Councillor Jessup.
No.
Councillor Jones first, Councillor.
Has there been, it's just a co-op question, has there been any thing about the co-op signage?
Yes, that was going to be my any other business. The planning officer has emailed today and said that the conservation officer has advised that in this instance they have no objections. This is owing to the quality and location of the existing building, as well as the size and location of the proposed signage. In light of the conservation officer's comment, do the town council still wish to maintain their objection to this scheme? So it's for the internal halo lighting at the co-op. So the conservation officer does not have a problem with it in this instance. So they're now asking.
I have to say, I'm tempted to say that we should continue. I know I wasn't actually part of that discussion, but the issue is it runs contrary to our current internal guidance. Now, we might want to change our internal guidance, perhaps, but at the moment, given that it does, my instinct would be to say yes. But if others are convinced, and the reality is almost certainly going to be that if the conservation officer isn't going to object, we know what the ultimate outcome will be. But do we, as a matter of form, persist with the objection?
I agree with you, because I'm always afraid of thin end of wedges, that you give way in somewhere where it doesn't matter terribly much, and you're giving a message to all the other people who quite likely would be saying, well, they've done it, why can't we?
Anybody else, any views?
I agree with you.
Right, I think we go back and tell them that the objection is
Stands,
maintained.
yeah.
So, right, well, you're not technically a member of this committee, but you're here, so I might as well ask you, do you have anything for us?
No, thank you, nothing to add now.
Okay, now, I don't have anything to add. I think Lisa's just covered what she was going to say. So unless anybody has anything else, I I close the meeting at 9:20, which is late for us.